Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you. I see some familiar faces and some folks I don't know, and it's just a pleasure to have this time, especially knowing what's kind of come before. I told John that I reached out to my friends Andrew Crinks and Raheem Buford when I saw that they had been with you, and they just said it was a wonderful time. So I'm just really excited to have this time with you. As John mentioned, I work for an organization called the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. If you want to learn more about the work of the CFSY, of course, I'll be talking about it today, but you can go to cfsy.org and see more about what we do. But really just thrilled to be here with you because a lot of times I end up trying to thread a needle. I talk to a lot of lawmakers about ending life without parole for kids, and I try to thread a needle where, the CFSY is not a faith-based organization. I don't know a lot of times when I'm talking to a lawmaker what their faith background is, but I feel like I'm always talking about very, very important faith theological issues when I'm talking about how we treat kids. And it's really nice to be in a space, where you can just kind of explicitly say that's what we're talking about. Before I forget, I'm going to be talking some about a book that I have recently had the opportunity to write, which we'll talk a little bit about that. But as we begin, I want to point out that the cover image on this book, the book is called Confessions of a Former Prosecutor, but the cover image of the book is taken from the Criminal Justice Building downtown. If you go downtown and you look at the Criminal Justice Building on the corner, you see this statue of Lady Justice holding the scales, and underneath it says, "The first duty of society is justice." The first duty of society is justice. And I think it's so important to take time in spaces like this to reflect on whether that is true, and if that is true, what the implications of that are. I think we go to church. I went to law school. The word justice comes up a lot in these contexts, but we seldom take time to think about, well, what is that? What is justice if it's our first duty? Or if we open our Bibles, and we see, "He has shown you, O mortal one, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy/kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Or if we look at another prophet and it says to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, or when Jesus counsels us to seek first the kingdom of God and his justice, and everything else will sort itself out. I know growing up in church, I did not have a lot of opportunities to think through, well, what is this justice? And even when I went to law school, we sort of took it for granted that we were all talking about the same thing and never actually got around to talking about, well, what is justice? And in our culture, I think that justice a lot of times is a euphemism for punishment. That justice is tantamount to punishment. And I think that, the reason why I say that is because if you pay attention to the news, when something bad has happened and when someone is held responsible by putting them in prison or as Joe Engel talked about, giving them the death penalty, a lot of times the way that we describe that, we have this very quick saying that says, "Justice was served. Justice was done." There was one time, I grew up in Antioch, and there's a church called Lighthouse Baptist Church. And years ago, some teenagers broke into Lighthouse Baptist Church. I don't think they did a lot of damage. I think they busted out a window. They stole a little bit of money and I think a couple of cell phones from the lost and found. And the minister there at the Lighthouse Church said, we're going to pray for these young people, but we expect justice. And I kind of thought, as I read that article, I thought, I think I know what he's talking about. And I think it's punishment, that he wants to see these kids punished. Well, this overarching idea that justice is equal to punishment has had some devastating consequences. I'm here to talk primarily about juvenile justice. The way that we hold kids accountable is largely a matter of just inflicting more suffering upon them. But we have to locate juvenile justice within the larger context of mass incarceration. And what we know is that, beginning especially in the 1980s, and then it just went to warp speed in the 1990s, we started sending more and more people to prison for longer and longer periods of time for more and more things. We started, I think we kind of lost our moral imagination and started thinking that there is not a social problem that we cannot punish our way out of. And so if you're talking about mental health issues, right now the United States prison system is the largest mental health provider in the country. When you're talking about substance abuse issues, we obviously criminalize that. We have the war on drugs. So when people self-medicate, we treat that as a criminal justice issue. We even do it with things like poverty and not having adequate housing. We'll pass laws that criminalize sleeping in public, for example. We just seem to think that we can punish our way out of just about every problem, and we took that same mentality and we applied it to children. For those of you who remember the 1990s, that's when the word super predator was coined. And it was in magazines and newspapers. Super predator, the myth of the super predator is this idea that there is this new, again, sort of mythical young criminal who cannot be rehabilitated. This new kind of criminal, there's nothing you can do for this person except throw them away. And so what we saw was children as young as 13 and 14 years old being tried as adults and then being given the absolute most extreme adult sentences, up to and including life without the possibility of parole and even the death penalty. This completely goes against everything that I think we know as people who've been teenagers, people who have raised teenagers, people who've studied adolescent brain development, all tell us that a 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old child is not the same as an adult, that their brain has not fully formed yet, especially the prefrontal lobe part of the brain, which is what is responsible for decision making. When you're making a decision and you think about the risks and the consequences of that decision, when you're thinking about impulse control, these are all functions of the front part of the brain, which does not fully develop until you're about 25 years old. And we know that. We see that children are treated differently in every other aspect of the law, right? A person younger than 18 cannot vote because we don't trust their decision-making ability. They can't serve on a jury. They cannot get married. They cannot sign a contract. There's a reason why we don't let kids enter into contracts. And in a lot of instances, we're taking kids who are too young to do those and even drive a car oftentimes. We'll take a 14, 15-year-old, give them life without the possibility of parole before they're even old enough to drive a car. And so the work that I do with the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth was born out of a recognition that we cannot pretend that children are the same as adults. They're not just little adults. You cannot throw them away. You cannot pretend like they're just as culpable. Now, a 14-year-old kid can pull the trigger of a gun just as easily as I can, but we're not the same. We can't be held accountable in the same ways. So the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, if any of you are familiar with Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, which was made into a movie starring Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan, Brian Stevenson was one of the founders of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth because he recognized that we've got to get away from sentences like life without parole for kids. Because what a life without parole sentence does is it just eliminates all hope. And it basically says to a child, 15, 16, 17-year-old child, it does not matter what you do over the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. We're not going to ever look at you again. We're not going to ask, who have you become? We're going to take all your hope away, and we are going to condemn you to die in prison. And so Brian and others like him said, that this is a horrible human rights violation. It's a racist practice. A black kid is 10 times more likely to receive life without the possibility of parole than a white kid is. And for all these reasons, we've just got to do away with it. And so the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth was born in 2009. At the time, only 5 states had abolished life without parole for kids. We've had a lot of success in a lot of different states. We're up to 28 states that have ended life without parole for kids, and an additional 4 have no one actually serving, even though it hasn't formally been abolished. They have no one serving. Obviously, as with just about everything, the Deep South is a stronghold for these sorts of sentences. And so the only southern states that have abolished life without parole for kids, actually Texas did 11 years ago, Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia. But as far as the Carolinas, they both have it. Tennessee has it, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida. Kids can get life without parole, and we have them. So the work that I do is going around trying to convince people that this is an immoral practice and that children should never be condemned to die in prison. Now, I came to this work. Well, let me pause there, because I don't just want to talk the whole time. If you have questions or things you'd like to say, please feel free to jump in and interrupt. Anybody have any? Yes, sir.
What's the most common reason why a child gets sentenced to life without parole?
So the U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in on the issue of kids getting life without parole in a series of decisions, and they have said it can only be for a homicide offense. Now, that sounds, you would think that okay, what's the worst of the worst, right? It's people who've killed somebody. But I have a friend who, when he was 15 years old, his older brother was dealing drugs, and there had been a deal that went bad, and his brother got ripped off. And so his brother told him, my friend's name is Marshawn, he said, "Marshawn, go get me a car." And so 15-year-old Marshawn goes and steals a car, and his brother gets in with 2 other guys and tells Marshawn where to go. So Marshawn drives there. They say, "Stay in the car, Marshawn, behind the wheel." The other 3 get out, and they've gone to this rival drug dealer's place, and they kill him. And then they come back out and get the car and tell Marshawn to drive away. Marshawn never got out of the car. Marshawn did not have a gun. But as a result of the felony murder rule, which says that someone was killed while a felony was being committed, and Marshawn was involved in that felony, he was guilty of first-degree murder, and he got life without the possibility of parole. That was in Illinois. The law changed in Illinois. Marshawn got out, and he's now going to law school on a full ride, which I'll get to these stories about what happens when you stop sentencing children to life without parole. What do they do with that opportunity? Are there other questions before I go on? I got into this work. It has been a long and winding road, which is, again, why I wrote a book about it. I started my career very content to be a cog in the wheel of this justice as punishment system. When I was in college, I interned with the Davidson County Prosecutor's Office. I thought, well, these guys are wearing the white hat. These guys are standing up for the rights of victims. These guys are making society safer. And I just thought, public safety is important. So I went to law school to be a prosecutor and got a job working in the Tennessee Attorney General's office, where I had a hand in many felony murder cases and many cases involving juveniles who got incredibly long sentences. And I never lost a moment's sleep about that, because I believed that the system was working. And I believed that the people who were causing harm deserved to be punished. You do the crime, you do the time. Probably none of that was ever going to change for me until the college I attended, which is Lipscomb, started a college prison program called the LIFE program. And it's the Lipscomb Initiative for Education, and it started offering Lipscomb classes out at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And the guy who started the program, whose name is Richard Good, had been a professor of mine while I was an undergrad. He knew that I was a prosecutor. He wanted to offer a pre-law class. And so he emailed me and said, Preston, I'd love to take you to coffee and talk to you about this program and see if you'd be interested in teaching out at the women's prison, which I just jumped at the chance. That just sounded like such a great opportunity, you know, and of course I had a blast at Lipscomb and think the world of Dr. Good. So I went out there, and I went out there thinking, these poor, pitiful women, you know, it's so good that Lipscomb is doing something for them, and I can be a part of that, because I know that recidivism rates tend to drop as people get educated, you know, so what a good thing to do for those poor, miserable people. What I found, though, was that they were great, and I was the one who really needed some help. And they were gracious enough to provide it for me, because I had never been in a room with people who were serving sentences like life without parole. There was not a courtroom. And in a courtroom, you don't get to know anybody. You just get to hear the absolute worst details of the absolute worst moment of a person's life. And that is such a dangerous position for a Christian to be in, where all you know about somebody is the worst thing that they've ever done, and you see them only at their lowest point. But in that prison classroom, we put our chairs in a circle, and we started sharing about ourselves, and I started hearing details that prosecutors and judges and juries don't ever get to hear about the context in which these crimes occurred. And they were all terrible. You know, none of these people had just gone out and just decided, I'm going to do something really terrible. You know, they were all caught in a spiral of abuse and mental health issues, neglect, prior victimization and trauma, self-medication, poverty often. And in a moment, they made a terrible decision in the midst of terrible circumstances that was going to have, you know, consequences that would last 10 or 20 or 50 years. And one of the people that I met was named Centoya Brown. Centoya was a student in one of my judicial process classes. And I bring her up because she went into the system as a 16-year-old child. She was born with fetal alcohol syndrome because her mother abused alcohol every day of her pregnancy. Her mother never got off of drugs and alcohol, so Centoya ended up, you know, bouncing around family members, and then finally landed with an adoptive parent. She was, you know, struggling with school and stuff. She ended up running away. She was living on the streets and immediately became a target for a trafficker. And so 16-year-old Centoya is strung out. She's been raped a number of times, and a man picks her up. She was 16. A 43-year-old man picks her up over off Murfreesboro Road, takes her back to his house, shows her his gun collection, which really freaks her out. In her mind, that was a very, very clear threat. She interpreted that as, and she was like, I'm not going to be hurt again or possibly killed. Her trafficker had given her a gun for protection, and so when the man turned his back, she shot him in the back of the head and fled. And that's a first-degree murder. And you shoot an unarmed person in the back of the head, that's going to be first-degree murder. She goes to juvenile court. It doesn't really matter what evidence there is that she needs to be, you know, held in juvenile court. If you commit first-degree murder, they're going to put you up in adult court. And when you're found guilty of first-degree murder in Tennessee, the automatic sentence, the least you're going to get, is 51 years. So at 16 years old, Centoya was thrown away for 51 years. And I got to know her in that classroom, and she was brilliant, and she was so excited to be in college and to be learning. She loved to read. She loved to engage in, you know, the kind of dialogue you have in college classes. She was recommending books to me to read. We just got to be friends, you know. And these are the kinds of people that you meet when you go into those places and you have conversations and you have proximity to people. You find out that they are not, you know, the way that the media portrayed Centoya was, number one, teen prostitute, number two, monster, because she had killed somebody in cold blood. That was the way that the media talked about her at the time of her trial. But I find out this was not a teen prostitute. This was a victim of trafficking. And she acted, in her mind, she was acting out of self-defense. And again, this was one moment, this crystallized, awful moment, was never going to happen again. And what she needed was not 51 years. What she needed was a community of people to care about her and try to see that her wounds were healed, and try to move forward and figure out, what are we going to do for Centoya? And what instead we said, we're just going to throw Centoya away for 51 years, which is, the same thing essentially as a life without parole sentence. While that class was going on, I had left the Attorney General's office by this time. I had become so riddled with angst over what was becoming clear to me about the nature of the system of punishment that we have. I finally got to the point where, I wasn't sleeping very well. I didn't feel good about the work that I was being called upon to do. I felt like I was sort of betraying these new friends that I had, and so I finally quit my job as a prosecutor, which was, a really difficult decision, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. But about halfway through the semester, when I had Centoya in class, I was still receiving opinions from courts, because a lot of the work that I was doing was appeals. And appeals courts take a long time to issue opinions. You'll file your brief, you'll go to the argument, and then the judges on the panel will sort of take it under advisement. And they'll have to read through the record, and they'll have to write their opinion and agree what the outcome should be, and then they publish the opinion. That can take months and sometimes even a year or so. And so I'm still every now and then getting an opinion in the mail on a case that I worked on. And so one of these days, when I was not teaching at the prison, I go out to my mailbox, and there's an envelope in there that's from the Tennessee appellate court system. And so I stand there at the mailbox, I open it up to see, what case was this, what was the outcome. And I open it up and I look, and the person's name on the opinion just hit me cold. It was Centoya Brown. And I had not even discerned, when I had her in class, that a year earlier I had argued that she needed to spend 51 years in prison, that I had been the prosecutor who was assigned to her appeal. That's how dehumanizing the system is, that it's just a case. I worked on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases. Of course I don't remember everybody's name. That's how the system is designed. So that when I had the Centoya Brown in class, I never made the connection to the Centoya Denise Brown. I had a banker's box of records in my office while I worked on that case. I never saw Centoya. She was already locked up. I was working on her appeal. But I saw that name on the opinion, and all of a sudden it's like everything just, why would you ever feel comfortable working in a system that will dehumanize and throw away a 16-year-old child? That realization, I think, I want to come back to the idea of justice. That the first duty of society is justice. That we want justice to roll down like waters. That we've been told what is good, and it is that we should do justice. I think that Centoya and we needed an experience of justice in that moment, but not punishment, right? We've got to get away from this idea that justice just equals punishment, or I would say vengeance, because vengeance is the only thing that will cause you to throw away a child. Centoya and I needed an experience of justice that was not rooted in punishment, but a way for things to be made right. When things have gone wrong, and when people have been hurt and harm has been done, you need to have a way to make that right. We had a broken, fractured relationship that needed to be healed. We needed reconciliation. That was our first duty. And if that's what we mean when we say justice, then it is right that we put that on our buildings, that the first duty of society is to heal what has been broken. The first duty of society is to bring about reconciliation and healing when things have gone wrong. It doesn't mean there's no accountability. And Centolla was being held accountable. It was in an inappropriate way, but there was some accountability. I needed to be held accountable. I needed to be held accountable. But I didn't need to be punished and made to suffer. So we needed an authentic expression of justice. That was our first duty. That's what we needed. To do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. We had to have a measure of humility. I think about the title of the book. We were very deliberate about what we called Confessions of a Former Prosecutor, Abandoning Vengeance, and Embracing True Justice. That was all very, very intentional. We called it Confessions, not Tales of a Former Prosecutor or Reflections of a Former Prosecutor, because we needed something that had some sacramental weight to it. A confession is one of the sacraments, and it's I know it's also called reconciliation, but I tend to think of confession as sort of being a prerequisite to reconciliation. Before Centolla and I could be reconciled, I had to confess to her and say, I'm so sorry that I said these things about you that weren't true. I never should have spoken about a person that way, that they deserve to be thrown away for 51 years. So I needed to confess that to her. I think about the subtitle, Abandoning Vengeance and Embracing Through. Abandoning is not tweaking. A system that will throw a child away does not need to be tweaked. We don't need to reform our broken approach to justice. We have to abandon that. Again, it's not to abandon accountability, but to abandon the idea that justice equals throwing children away. And vengeance, like I said, that's the only thing that could cause us to take a 13. I worked with someone who got life without parole when they were 13. That's just institutionalized vengeance. That's taking a little baby and saying, you have no hope. And overwhelmingly the people who are doing this in our state houses are Christians. They're Christians. I go to their offices and see the Bibles on their desks. And they're telling me that children deserve nothing better than to die in prison. Fortunately, a kid can't get the death penalty anymore, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court. But I had a lawmaker in Ohio tell me that if it were still constitutional, he would support the death penalty for children. Right. And he was a Christian. And I just wonder, how have we missed it? How have we missed it to this degree that we settle for vengeance? And then true justice, abandoning vengeance and embracing true justice, which again, I think about making things right. I think about healing. I think about reconciliation. I think about shalom. That's something that we talk about in my law classes, is that I think we need a new word. Because justice may have been so tainted for us that we might want to continue to slip back and think that it means retribution. And instead we need to be thinking about a whole new, more holistic, bigger concept. Centolla and I needed a lot of healing to be made whole. And fortunately, Centolla is a very, very gracious person. And so when I went to her, and of course she had received a copy of the opinion as well, and she was waiting for me out in the hallway outside our classroom when I had to go back to teach the next class. And she looked heartbroken because she knew that this person that she was close to, that had good conversations with, that I had betrayed her without even knowing her. But she mustered up the moral imagination to forgive me. She said, you were doing your job. And it's a job that you no longer feel comfortable doing. But she said, in that moment, she said, what you're really going to need to do, though, is find other kids who are without hope and give them a voice. That was her charge to me back in 2009. And so it's been a real pleasure to get to lean into this work, this current, I would call it, a current of abandoning vengeance and embracing justice and seeing where that current, where those mighty waters can take us. So while I've got a little bit of time, let me pause again because there may be questions or thoughts. But I do want to, yes, go ahead.
So have were the other children in prison since then? I know Centoya has been released.
She was released back in 2019. I'll just tell her story real quick. The answer is yes, and I'll come back to that. But Centoya was released. She did not have to serve 51 years because her case kind of blew up and went viral, if you remember. LeBron James tweeted about her, Rihanna tweeted about her, Kim Kardashian, all of them saying 16-year-olds should not get 51 years. It does not matter what they do. They should not be thrown away, never to be looked at again for 51 years. And the publicity around her case got the attention of Governor Haslam, who convened the Board of Parole to have a hearing to look at her case. And she, by this time, she and I had been friends for almost a decade, and she invited me to speak at her clemency hearing, which was it was extremely cathartic to get to publicly say that I believe that she should be released, because I had publicly said a decade earlier that she needed to be locked up, and it's like that had to be undone. Every time I would go visit her at the prison, I'd go through the gates and the razor wire and the big clanging steel doors and the pat downs. And it was just a reminder that while she may have forgiven me, she was still living with the consequences of the position that I took as the prosecutor in her appeal. So to get to sort of address that head on in front of another public body and say this was wrong, the arguments I made about her were wrong, you know, she's a good person, she deserves to be released. I feel like that needed to happen. That was sort of like a necessary part of the accountability. You know, there had to be sort of a public reckoning. And fortunately, Governor Haslam did grant her clemency. After 15 years, she was released, and she's out, and she's doing great work. But in terms of the other children, that's been one of my frustrations around the Centoya Brown case, is that everybody just wanted to talk about Centoya Brown. And I think that's kind of how our culture works. You know, we fixate on that one without zooming out and saying, well, who else? And it's like as soon as Centoya got relief, the cameras shut down. And you forget that there were 3,000 children across the country who were given life without the possibility of parole. And many, many more who were given such extremely long sentences they might as well be life without parole. And they're never going to see their name become a hashtag. They're never going to get LeBron to tweet about them to his millions of followers. So what about them? You know, why do we only care about the one that Rihanna knows her name? Why don't we care about any of the others? Why do we not, why has there not been a reckoning with the fact that the U.S. is the only country in the world known to sentence children to die in prison? Nobody else does that. You know, I'm so glad we have this space, and you've heard from Raheem and Joe and Andrew, because I mean, here we have the largest prison population in human history, both in terms of its total size and per capita. You know, it's not like there's a country out there that, well, they're just not as big in per capita. No, we've got both. And a lot of them are too young to do all the things I mentioned, you know. So there has to be a reckoning with all these other people, especially children. So I'll tell you just a few stories about other children, because you know, people want to be safe. They want to know, well, if we start rethinking justice and we think in terms of healing and wholeness, are we going to be less safe? Because these are people these are homicide offenses, you know. What's going to happen if we start giving them second chances? So there's a guy that I work with whose name is JMO, and J-Mo got life without parole when he was 16 years old. And he did about 25 years of that sentence before the law changed and he was resentenced. When J-Mo came home, he was living in a real economically depressed area. And he noticed there was a lot of homelessness, a lot of people out, asking for food. And so J-Mo just kind of got in the habit of packing lunches. And as he would go around throughout his day, if he saw somebody asking for money or whatever, he would give the person some food. And so some of J-Mo's friends in the neighborhood knew of this practice that J-Mo had. They start giving J-Mo a little bit of money here and there, or some lunch meat or something. Here you go, J-Mo, I know you do this thing. Here, this is to help with what you do. More and more people start hearing about J-Mo to the extent that J-Mo finally has to start a nonprofit. And now his nonprofit has grown, this food justice nonprofit, because he lives in a food desert, has grown, and he now feeds over 400 needy families a week out of this little nonprofit. J-Mo he's one of the super predators. He's one of the ones that we said, you know what, rehabilitation for some, not for J-Mo. The best thing you can do for J-Mo is just throw him away. But once he gets his second chance, he's proving that was wrong. I think about another guy who's actually a friend of J-Mo's named Lorenzo. Lorenzo also got life without parole. Lorenzo, super predator. Can't do anything for Lorenzo. But he got a second chance. While he was locked up, serving life without parole, I guess he needed something to do with himself. And so he taught himself to read Braille. And once he gets out, he figures out that there is a real need for Braille interpreters. And so he now contracts with publishers to take their books and transcribe them into Braille so that blind people have reading material. Lorenzo was one of the worst of the worst. And I think about, and when I'm with people of faith, when I'm talking to a lawmaker and they've got the Bible on their desk, I ask them what Jesus pointed to as one of the signs of the coming kingdom. And it's that blind people can see. And we've got J-Mo out here putting that into action, making sure that blind people who want to read have that opportunity. I think about my friend Donnell. Donnell, when he was 16, got the death penalty. That was before the death penalty had been prohibited for children. 16-year-old was sentenced to die. Then the U.S. Supreme Court says, no, you can't sentence a child to death. And so he gets converted to life without parole. But then the U.S. Supreme Court again weighs in on cases like Donnell's and said, you know what, maybe you can get life without parole, but he's going to need a new sentencing hearing. And so he gets a new sentencing hearing and he gets life with parole instead of life without. And a few years later, he makes parole. And so he goes home. He lives in Philadelphia, and he lives in a hard area of Philadelphia. And so Donnell starts a violence intervention program. And so all through the night, Donnell is on the streets of Philadelphia as part of his violence intervention program, trying to find kids who are where he once found himself, trying to make sure that they don't make the same kind of mistake that landed him in prison. See, that's work I cannot do. I cannot go into the inner city and run a violence intervention program. I wouldn't know how to do that. I wouldn't know what those kids need. I'm not an expert. Donnell is an expert. Donnell has lived it. Donnell was thrown away. So when you throw someone like that away, you actually take the person that you need to make the community safer, and you rip them out of that community. So when people come home like Donnell, it's not just that they don't commit new crimes, which they've got a 1% rate of recidivism. Former juvenile lifers, 1.14% is what the recidivism rate is. But it's not just that they're not committing new crimes, it's that they are finding creative, imaginative ways to serve their communities and make them safer. So we can't afford to leave people like Donnell in prison. they're the ones who can come home and help. I work with a guy named Eric Alexander who, when he got home, he started writing youth programs for the Metro Nashville Public Schools, how to interact with at-risk kids. And he just based his program off of what did he think he needed that might would have kept him from the situation that landed him in prison. I wouldn't know how to write that program, but Eric did. I'll tell you about one more, and then I'll just kind of open it up. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, obviously these are stories of like such incredible resilience in the face of a horrible situation. What if for those who may argue that even though there wasn't a possibility of parole, that these are examples of rehabilitation in the prison system, that these children were in very difficult circumstances, and had they not been taken from those circumstances and rehabilitated, that they would not have the really positive outcomes that we talked about. So I guess I wonder, like, just to make that as advocate in that way.
Yeah.
Prison as rehabilitation for
Yeah.
children, even if there wasn't a possible at that time.
And so when I talk to lawmakers, I try to always have someone with me who has lived experience so that they can articulate with nuance a lot of what you said. That, you know, Centoya was in a terrible situation. No question she needed to be removed from that. She needed to be away from that trafficker. Some people need to be removed from, you know, similar abusive relationships, gang life, street life. You know, you're not going to change. You know, you can't overcome all that. It's so hard. So some sort of a change in context is necessary. But none of my friends credit prison with what happened for them. Over and over again, what they say is, yes, I needed to be removed, and I was, and that was good. But really what I needed was to grow up, because I was 15, 16, 17. And they'll tell you that they caused a lot of trouble early on, and then they hit 25 years old when their brain fully formed. And they looked, over and over again, this is the story they say. I looked at my life, and I was serving life without parole. But I still had a life to live, and I wanted it to count for something. And at that point, I started working on my GED. Or at that point, I took a victim impact class, and I tried to figure out, you know, how I had impacted someone, and I remembered that I too had been impacted by violence, you know. Or I started doing vocational stuff, you know. Eric started writing his youth program while he was still locked up. So none of them, to my recollection, ever credit prison for the change. You know, they say, hey, it was good for me to be out of that context. But they're digging from within themselves, you know. And I think about Eddie Ellis. That's the last story I'll tell, because Eddie, he had gotten, you know, a crazy long prison sentence. And while he was locked up, he started reading about self-care. And he became like a minister of self-care within the prisons, and now that he's home. He leads self-care retreats for both people who've caused harm and people who have suffered harm. He recognizes how much healing is necessary, and so we'll host these self-care retreats, and we'll just go out, and it'll be in a beautiful place with fishing and hammocks, and you can talk to therapists or you can take naps, because all of these people need healing and self-care. And so he was invited to Georgetown Law School one time to share about his work in the area of self-care. And also on the panel was the judge who had called him a menace to society and given him I don't think it was life without parole, but it was many, many, many years, and said there's nothing we can do for Eddie Ellis except throw him away. And the judge had brought Eddie's pre-sentence report, in which all that stuff was laid out. And this is in front of all of Georgetown Law School. And he introduced himself. I'm the judge. Eddie Ellis was in my courtroom. I imposed that sentence. Here's what I said about Eddie. And I just want everyone here to understand that that was wrong. Nobody ever should have talked about Eddie or any other child using those kinds of words. And I think, again, that's what's needed, is that kind of a confession. You know, we've got to confess that the way we have taught super predator, I mean, we can't talk about other human beings that way, you know? And so I think getting to that point where we're willing to acknowledge with our mouths and our lives that we are going to abandon institutionalized vengeance and embrace a justice that is healing. That is where I think we want to go as a people of faith. Let me just read this real quick thing, and I'll be done, and we can talk if y'all have questions. As I've worked with these folks all over the country, I have just been reminded how often we are told to be afraid. How often we are told that there is an other out there that you need to be afraid of, and that we demonize that other, we target them, we scapegoat them, we say that they do not belong. That's what happened to Centoya. But then I think about somebody like Father Greg Boyle, who runs Homeboy Industries, and he invites us to imagine not excluding people, but instead imagining a circle of compassion. And we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And in my experience, to quote Father Richard Rohr, the ones that we think we're going to go save end up saving us. And in the process, redefine for us the very meaning of the word salvation. That, I think, is what was waiting for me when I went out there to teach that first prison class. And I think that continues to be the invitation to rethink all of that. So let me pause, and I will just listen to y'all's thoughts and questions. Let's go here first. Yep.
Well, I guess to follow on to that conversation about someone needing to be taken out of a situation, what should be done? How can we take people out of those situations? If not prison, where's the next? What is the solution?
Yeah, it's so wonderful that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we can learn from what is working in other places. So in other countries, they're not out to inflict more suffering. To the degree that someone needs to be removed, which is drastic, that's a very drastic response. But to the extent that they need to be removed, it is so they can be made well. So if you look at a country like Denmark, for Denmark, a 10 or 15-year prison sentence represents a terrible failure. They're thinking, why would it take 10 or 15 years to help make this person well? Where have we gone wrong? Where for us, 10 or 15 years, man, we're just getting started. And so if you remove someone, the goal of that removal makes all the difference. We remove in order to hurt, instead of removing only when it's necessary to heal. And those places of healing in other countries, it's still accountability. They pour resources into the folks so that they have assurance that when the time comes for them to no longer be removed, that they are doing exactly what we would expect healed people to do. So it's a totally different goal, right? Yes, sir.
Interesting, you mentioned Father Rohr. I was walking this morning, listening to Renee Brown's interview with him, and they were talking about faith. He said, what's the biggest problem with faith? He said, it's a sin of certitude. He says, when you're certain, you're right. And it sounds like with some of these legislators and with some clergy, they're so certain that their way is the only way, that it's detrimental to what they're truly trying to accomplish. What do you do to try to break through that certainty with lawmakers or judges or anything like that?
Well, sometimes I'll share my story because I think if I can set an example as someone who was certain and then, started seeing some light come through the cracks, that makes it a little bit easier for other people. It's kind of like jumping off a high dive. If I've seen somebody do it first, then maybe I'm a little bit less willing to be paralyzed, or less liable to be paralyzed by fear, and trust that, it's okay. It's okay to admit that you're wrong. It's not being feckless and wishy-washy. It's being a morally serious person. That admitting when we're wrong. I mean, as my friend David Dark says, the first word of Jesus' gospel is repent. So I'm not sure what I'm wrong about right now, but it's something, and I'm going to need to repent of it at some point when I figure that out. And so that readiness to model that for people, I think is important. And the other thing I'll say is I try to avoid the idea that I need to change anybody's mind. What I hope I can do is just help them see the issue through their lenses. So I'll be real honest. If I'm talking to somebody who's got a Make America Great Again hat on their shelf, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, Donald Trump, that's a controversial figure. But everybody agrees the First Step Act was the right thing to do. That we had a big problem, and 30,000 people are now home thanks to the First Step Act. And ending life without parole in Wisconsin, for example, you might as well call that the Second Step Act. Because Trump didn't call it the only Step Act. He recognized that there was going to need to be more done. And so that way I haven't created an enemy and said, what you really need to do is convert and be a Democrat, and all this is going to be fine. Because that's not true. There's Democrats who are terrible on this issue. It's trying to help them see the issue through lenses that make them understand, hey, you can support this, What other questions? Yes?
What are kind of your experiences with school systems in this work and the school to prison pipeline that we hear a lot about, and what the role you think schools should play after?
So within the larger movement of what you would call restorative justice, that what we have is retributive justice. Very few questions get asked. What crime was committed? Who's responsible? What's the punishment going to be? Once those are answered, the news cameras shut off, the case is closed, and it goes away. Within a restorative justice paradigm, there's all sorts of questions. What do the parties need? Starting with the person who suffered the harm. If somebody breaks into my house, tears down my door, steals jewelry or a television, who's going to pay for all that, right? Our current system doesn't do a good job of answering those questions. And the fact that I'm terrified, why did this happen to me? We don't ask that question, but in restorative justice, it's about asking bigger, better, broader questions. And schools are a great place for experimenting with those new paradigms. And there's a lot of school. There's a book, the little book of restorative justice in schools, where you can see that when there's conflict, viewing that through a restorative lens as opposed to a retributive lens. And it's so helpful to bring everybody together with a trained facilitator / mediator and try to ascertain why this happened and how we're going to agree to move forward to bring about some healing. The zero tolerance policies, the automatic suspensions. There was a kid, I can't remember where this happened, but there was a kid who was hit with he made a threat. He alluded to a school shooting and made a threat to some friends, which of course has to be taken very, very seriously, of course. But he's now being criminally charged with terrorism, and he had no access to guns, and he was 13. So here you've got a child shooting his mouth off in a very inappropriate, dangerous way. But again, who did it? What's the punishment going to be? That's where we go, instead of trying to, figure out what's going on with this child, So I think that schools is a great opportunity, to start maybe where the stakes are a little bit lower, but see that, if you have a different paradigm and approach it with a different set of lenses, you can get a much better outcome than just throwing somebody away. Yes, sir.
When you talk to a group like this, you go home, what do you find yourself hoping that we do next?
I mean, you can start so small, reading a book, that maybe you heard about, or doing a Google search, going to the CFSY resource page, or jotting down my phone number and shoot me a text. For me, it's all about proximity, and that's what Brian Stevenson says too. Proximity is what changes people, that you can't demonize somebody that you know. And that's the trick, man. And it's hard to go to prisons. They don't make it easy. Those fences keep people out just as effectively as they keep people in. Not everybody's physically able to go to a prison or feels comfortable. I had a student one time on the first night of class from Lipscomb. He got to the parking lot, saw the fencing and the wire, never parked his car, just turned around and headed back to campus. It was so intimidating. And that's what it's supposed to be, But if there's a way for you to figure out who can I be pen pals with, some of these folks never get letters, And so I've got a letter right now from a guy who's been waiting on me to write back for a couple of weeks, They are starved for contact with the outside world. They love to know that people know about them, that they're not forgotten. So any way that you can, whether it's going to a prison, writing to a prisoner, or just learning. Raheem Buford, who spoke to you, has a book. Look up Raheem's book, Save Your Own Life is what it's called, and read about the experience of someone who was locked up. My friend Eddie Ellis has a book called A Change is Possible on Amazon. Just reading that perspective and that little bit of proximity, because that's what Greg Boyle talks about too. That's what changes. We go to the margins not to be helpful. We go to there to be changed, and that proximity is what changes. It's what changed me.
Thank you.
Chaplains at jail and prison can sure give people an idea of what.
Yeah. I mean, contacting the chaplain at the Metro Nashville jail or at Riverbend prison and saying, what kind of volunteer opportunities do you have? What needs are there within your ministry here? That's a great idea, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I get a sense that, and I regret missing the first part of your presentation, that you have developed an understanding of mercy, and that's part of the understanding for restorative justice. Is that true, or could you comment about it? I mean, because rather than that, you did wrong and locked them up, and whatever. There's an element of mercy in all of that that may not always be evident in our current society.
Well, you're right, and I think that people who have learned it, it's like learning an instrument or something, or picking up a tune. Once you hear a song on the radio, and the more you hear it, the better you get, and then you can sing it to yourself, even when it's not playing, and the culture that we live in preponderates against mercy. But once you start, I've received it from all those incarcerated people. They've welcomed me, they've been gracious to me, so I know what it is to be treated with mercy. And I start figuring out, well, that's like the core of the gospel. If I'm praying, I could just pray most merciful. And there's my opening, and you start figuring out, well, that's what we're called to. We're called to do justice and to love mercy. And it's like riding a bike, it's hard at first because again, we have pastors out there who are calling for the death penalty sometimes. But once you start to learn the tune, to figure out how this goes, then it becomes part of who you are. And it's like, now I can see that everywhere, So there's a reason why Brian's book is called Just Mercy. He's recognizing that mercy is not antithetical to justice. Mercy is an essential component of doing justice. This is what we're called to, I think, as God's people. I want to respect. We'll go one last one. Yeah.
Just in a holistic point of view, is one of the biggest hurdles the fact that if politicians sincerely want to get to the root of this criminal justice problem, that and start embracing some different programs, they get labeled soft on crime, and they just don't want to go there.
It's true. You know, they're prosecutors too, and judges too, are elected officials, and they're scared to death to be thought of as soft on crime. But if you can convince them that this is being smart on crime, that this will save you money, you know, and that the people who come home are going to run violence intervention programs to make your neighborhoods safer, then they start to kind of get, again, you know, okay, I'm starting to pick up on this, you know, especially if you can convince them. Arkansas passed a bill in 2017. Are you saying that it's working in Arkansas, but it wouldn't work in Michigan? And all of a sudden it's like, okay, well now I'm starting to pick up that maybe this isn't such a bad idea after all. I've got a handful of books. If you want to pick one up, I'll be happy to provide one to you. I know you need to get to church, but I just appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation so much and all your thoughtfulness. So thank you.
Thank you.